Last summer, the United States had one of the very, very few rebellions in its history. 6 blocks of downtown Seattle formed an anarchist state that declared independence from the United States of America. They fought with the authorities alongside demanding the abolition of the police in general. Roving bands of protesters looted the city. Their utopian state literally collapsed into a dictatorship run by a SoundCloud rapper in the first couple hours, and they ran out of food within the first day. At the same time, erecting literal shrines to George Floyd. Shockingly, the reason it survived so long was that they were supported by the mayor of Seattle, who refused to evict the rebels. Left-wing media, in turn, reported this case in a very skewed way, describing the revolt as like a block party or peaceful protests. Some of my friends in Canada and Europe say it was barely even reported over there.
This was complemented by riots across the country. I'm sure lots of people have similar stories, but my friends in Philadelphia saw people use dynamite to blow up ATMs, widespread looting, fires, and breaking cars in wealthy downtown areas.
One of my friends from Richmond, Virginia told me that their police station was burned down, as well as literal buses in the street.
These riots and rebellions, which were largely supported and never denounced by the mainstream left-wing media, were based around the murder of a single black man in Minnesota.
What provoked an otherwise rational society to behave in this manner? That's the question of this video. Hi, I'm Rudyard, the guy behind What If Altist, and as a YouTuber, I've honestly always loved my fan base, and I'm really thankful for you guys. But I always felt like my community had more potential that hadn't been reached, that there'd be so many different ways that we could build a rich community and have beautiful experiences. This is a problem one of my best friends, housemate, and massive fan of What If Altist, Matthew DeMarcantonio, is working on. He's the CEO of Pearl, a tech company built around content creators like me, alongside fans like you. I'm launching a Pearl community in a week, and we're trying to get a wait list of 1,000, so I'd love if you click the link in the description and join the Pearl community. Pearl combines a bunch of different services to make the perfect platform for creators. It's a free-to-use app where you could, for example, commission me to make a map or have a half-an-hour conversation with you. There's also community chat with channels for various topics that works like Discord, and we're launching audio rooms in the future as well. There's also behind the paywall content as well. Click the link in the description and join the waitlist today. And I'm excited to see you all on Pearl.
This video is meant to be a breakdown of the social justice movement, pulling on my knowledge of history, philosophy, religion, and just thinking rationally. How did the movement start? What's its underlying psychology, rationale, and where I think it's going? You're going to start to see my political opinions, and even though I'm center-right, I wanted this video to be rooted in common sense and values that all reasonable people from different cultures or political beliefs could agree with.
Before we get started, I want to set up several definitions and tell you where I'm coming from. The first of which is that social justice is a very difficult movement to define, as we'll see, because it goes across many different parts of the left in many different fields. But I define social justice as a group whose identity is primarily built around fighting oppressive structures. And as an example of that, not all environmentalists are part of the social justice movement. Not all socialists are part of the social justice movement. But the social justice movement has many people who are part of the environmentalist and socialist movement. So I'd say most environmentalists in Western countries are aligned with the social justice movement. As another example, I would say President Biden and center-left groups like the New York Times aren't explicitly social justice. They're more center-left, but oftentimes they have lots of social justice people in their alliances, and so end up becoming beholden to them. At the same time, I don't stand against anyone who's trying to do genuine good and deal with legitimate oppression, where I would say the movement to get gay rights or the civil rights movement are both good, but I think these people come from a very different tradition than modern social justice, where Martin Luther King, for example, drew from the American tradition of us all being equal before the law and God. But these modern social justice people come from a Marxist tradition that tries to tear down the successful rather than pull up the downtrodden. At the same time, I don't think the right is blameless, and the right has done bad stuff in the last 2 years, but an ill done on the right doesn't justify an ill on the left.
Also, for those of you who are going to say this is a biased rant with no research, I've actually done a tremendous amount of study from all perspectives to get to this video essay. I've read anti-social justice pundits, as well as taking a course in gender studies, reading foundational texts of social justice, while also reading the philosophic and historical context like I always do with these videos. I've spent years in social justice-dominated educational institutions, and so I know their arguments inside out.
A lot of people don't know how far this movement's gotten, so I'm going to give some examples. For one, the Biden administration has referred to women as birthing people because saying mothers might be transphobic. The Canadian government passed a bill making it illegal not to use someone's preferred pronouns.
The Guardian posts articles saying hating men is okay.
CNN supports reparations for slavery, something most black people don't support. For the next round of Oscars, they have quotas on how many people from oppressed groups you have to have on the staff of your movie in order to be eligible.
These are all moderate left-wing places as well. I could go on and on with stories like this. In just my personal life, for example, how there were protests in the college I went to when the college Republican club tweeted out, "Vote for Trump," or my high school replaced a yearly Study a Foreign Country week with Social Justice Week. Alternatively, the only real demographic that really twists my words unfairly and tries to destroy me, especially on Reddit, is these leftists. My friends in the finance, entertainment, and tech industries say a significant minority, if not a majority of firms just aren't hiring white men anymore, going entirely for diversity hiring. I hate it when people say social justice is just a marginal movement, that it's confined to campus as an ivory tower of fools, or that it's not that radical. Both of these are normally what moderate left-wingers say to apologize for it in the same way moderate right-wingers do for extreme nationalists or normal people do for their delinquent cousins. The truth is that this is an ideology that controls much of the entertainment, media, and education worlds on almost every level, and a larger and larger share of the political and corporate worlds. How did we get here, though? Social justice is a very organic philosophy in that, unlike Marxism or Christianity, there was no one prophet who set the philosophy out, but instead it kind of just formed from a bunch of different roots and bumped around universities in the 1990s until it became really public after the 2008 financial crash, quickly amassing influence over all of society. People often roast Jordan Peterson for saying social justice formed as cultural postmodern Marxism, but that's historically accurate. If you wanted to find the place where the ball started rolling that eventually resulted in social justice, it would be with the disenchantment with traditional Marxism that came during and after World War II. Once leftists realized that Marxism had failed on every single level imaginable by not reaching a utopia, being poorer than capitalism, killing tens of millions of people, and not even attracting the working classes, leftists had to find a new story in order to retain their core beliefs. You know those weird cults that build their entire worldview around the world ending? Normally what happens when the world doesn't end is that those cults fracture and make some minor edits to why their overall story wasn't working. Why the world would actually end 10 years later, or why the world didn't end because blank conditions weren't met. That's what happens here as well with communism. The Frankfurt School believed that the bourgeoisie constructed culture, and so the revolution could only take place once the previous culture had been deconstructed enough that the working classes realized that it was inside their true interests to be communists. The emphasis switched from the working classes to women and ethnic minorities, as those groups rose to greater social predominance. Likewise, another branch of former communists in France founded the postmodern movement, which some of my really smart friends tell me actually has deep philosophic merit, but from my perspective largely translates to everything's a social construct for power and there should be no broader stories. Postmodernism doesn't believe in any broader theories of the world, but the logic that developed was something like, if broader stories are wrong, we can create a story which is about opposing other people's oppressive stories, which hold down oppressed groups. This sort of view became more popular in academia in the 1990s as the baby boomers, who are significantly more left-wing than their parents, took over academia. As the baby boomers gained power, academic departments went from being around 3/4 left-wing to 19/20ths, which resulted in an echo chamber in which pandering to one's own faction was the way to get ahead. As the boomers entered academia, you saw the development of various departments like women's, race, post-colonial, and queer studies, which largely existed as ideological laboratories for the movement that would develop. Social justice theory developed with all these various departments working together in a common ideological coalition. We'll go through these later, but a lot of the inconsistencies that came from social justice theory derive from how it was a series of unrelated academic departments that were allied in a common ideological cause. Let me give an example. It's why it's acceptable to change between genders but not between races. A cornerstone of social justice theory is that oppressive identities are fake and should be deconstructed as a moral good in of themselves, while subjugated identities are real, since they pull on the supposedly real or subjective experiences of the oppressed. Thus, for a white person to become a black person is evil, since it infringes upon the black person's positive identity. Meanwhile, for a man to become a woman is good, since it breaks down the oppressive structure of gender, even though in real terms the biological differences between the sexes are far greater than those between the races. Another version of this is that the feminist movement is in contradiction with the trans movement, in that if gender doesn't exist and is oppressive, then women's separate identity as women, which is biologically ingrained, carries no value. This is the root of the anti-trans feminist faction called TERFs. The thing that really elevated social justice into the public consciousness as an important ideology was the process of growing social tensions that I've talked about in these videos, largely driven by a combination of population growth and globalization. This meant the standard of living has in real terms gone down in Western countries for the last 50 years, which when paired with growing inequality caused an immense amount of social tension which created political polarization. This is really plain to see in that all the social justice keywords skyrocketed from complete obscurity to the public view with the failure of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which came shortly after the 2008 financial crash. The 2008 crash resulted in a rapid decline in standard of living, and like every other similar era of history, people fell into extremist ideologies that looked for scapegoats. In a system which seemed biased towards privileged white males, for example, of bailing out the banks, well, the economy fell apart, it looked reasonable. At the same time, the internet made populist movements like social justice easier to form. The internet made populism of both right and left-wing varieties more powerful, and we definitely see this with social justice, a movement promulgated and advanced collectively through the internet rather than through more mainstream top-down political ideologies.
I always wondered why social justice behaved in such a strategically irrational way. I mean, this is a movement that literally shits on its own followers as terrible people and actively looks to the most powerful and largest groups in society and says they're evil. But I didn't realize that this is primarily a mob-driven movement, not one that's controlled top-down.
When I say social justice is irrational, I'm not being biased. I'm stating a literal fact of its philosophy that even its founders would agree with. Like some right-wing parody of left-wingers, they believe that logic and objective reality are Western constructions. They take the postmodernist argument that all ways of knowing are social constructions and combine it with the Marxist viewpoint that all culture can be explained as a struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed. The Smithsonian, or the most important government-owned museum system in America, released this chart of whiteness, which went about describing whiteness with characteristics like hard work, being on time, or rational objective thinking. The first problem is that these are just objectively good things, and that societies that work hard automatically crush those that are lazy and are wealthier, but also that these aren't white either. The Celts in Britain at the birth of Christ had a value system that didn't value hard work or objectivity, and they're equally white. Meanwhile, the Muslim world used to be on the cutting edge of science. Similarly, if you go to a university STEM class in North America today, most of the students will be Asian. The most punctual, hardworking people in the world today are in Asia. Science obviously isn't a Western way of knowing, since other cultures are wholeheartedly embracing a scientific worldview, since it can be objectively proven. Ask an educated Indian if they support the oppressive Western way of scientific knowing, or their traditional magic systems, which, by the way, all races used to believe in, they'd say science without a thought. This all ends up being a backwards form of racism that exists to assuage the guilt of smug liberals at the expense of actually oppressed groups. Look at rap culture, in which modern culture literally encourages antisocial traits like crime, drug usage, or broken families in the African American community, since to judge it would be racism. However, this has really negative effects on the Black community. We should be supporting the productive elements of the African American community, not the most antisocial. Alternatively, look at West Coast cities like Vancouver or Los Angeles that have horrifying drug and homelessness problems, largely caused by the lack of an ability to judge on the part of a morally handicapped elite. The city of Vancouver had a policy of not judging homelessness and drug usage, with their only real policy being having clean, government-controlled sites to shoot heroin in. I was staying in downtown Los Angeles last week, and the homelessness crisis had made an otherwise wealthy and cool area into a deeply unpleasant and nearly uninhabitable place with the sheer amount of crazy homeless guys. However, mental illness and drug abuse is when people aren't in their right minds, and considering that Western societies had practically none of either 60 years ago, means that this is a pretty easily solvable problem. These addicted people and their families, whose lives they've often really hurt or ruined, would probably in the long view be thankful for a government that doesn't act like a smug, negligent parent. At its heart, social justice is a poorly constructed religion more than anything else. Just look at its main text today, like How to Be an Anti-Racist and White Fragility, which boil down to an idea of original sin in which white people must admit they are always racist no matter what they do, and nearly every action a white person does is inherently racist due to the racist structure of society. Nowhere are actual steps to deal with racial iniquities in the real world proposed. The cardinal flaw of the modern world, which our descendants will just facepalm continually, is our arrogance and overestimating human abilities. All the cool philosophies that developed since the Industrial Revolution, such as communism, fascism, and the various fads that have passed, all failed since they acted as if humans, and especially humans in positions of power, are capable of doing everything. This is a critical flaw in social justice philosophy, which believes that human nature is inherently changeable and all disparities can be solved. A great example of this comes with disparities, in which social justice philosophy believes that if there's any disparity, it must be the consequence of oppression. This ignores how immense disparities are the norm across almost every field you can think of. For example, every single one of the 20 tallest mountains in the world is in Asia. Or alternatively, the Germans ended up being the top piano manufacturers for all of history. The idea that oppression is the cause of almost every social factor is silly when you look at the horrifically legally repressed Chinese in Indonesia, who own 71% of the country's economy, while also only being 3% of the population. In short, you can't find a single statistic that isn't incredibly power law distributed. Take the gender pay gap, in which the average woman makes 76 cents for the average man, which has effectively been the rallying cry for the modern feminist movement. However, once you account for children, women actually make more money. Likewise, once experience and hours worked is accounted for, you find it shrinks to 96 cents for every dollar. Social justice believes all hierarchies are inherently oppressive, and hierarchies based on actual skills and ability are all evil. An example of this is that when Western businesses go to third world countries and pay workers there wages lower than first world countries, it's called oppressive. These companies almost always pay higher wages than the local economy does, and are paying the wages that are allowed at the lower productivity levels in the third world. Yet another example is how social justice treats the natural hierarchies like teacher and student or parent and child as oppressive. Modern left-wing doctrine says teachers should defer to what students want as much as possible, and parents should listen to their child's whims, even when in most circumstances the parents and teachers are wiser, and not letting them teach their pupils makes those pupils worse off. Letting your child or student do whatever they want is actively harming them in the long term, since it isn't enforcing discipline so they can't internalize the self-control that would allow them to thrive and hold society together. However, social justice doesn't believe in real knowledge, love, or hierarchies of skill, with the only force in the world being cynical power games. Think of how many schools don't teach real historical dates, for example, which means no real history actually ends up getting taught. Or how many parents let their kids act like demons, screaming or acting like spoiled brats, which will hold them back in the future at some point, because they won't learn to be polite and considerate. Social justice starts with the assumption that all humans are like blank pawns that are interchangeable, completely ignoring all historic and cultural factors in a purposeful stupidity. For example, in psychological studies, we've found men tend to be more interested in things and women in people. This explains why, say, this YouTube channel has turned out to be 96% male, or engineers and craftsmen are heavily male. Likewise, why women are in psychiatry, medicine, and childcare more than men. This isn't due to oppression, since this trend is most pronounced in the most gender-equal societies like Scandinavia or Israeli kibbutzes. Left-wingers think that human nature is inherently malleable, which it largely isn't. Although nurture does have big effects, so does nature. This leads to the left-wing obsession with controlling the discourse, or telling people what words they can and can't say, or with controlling pop culture. For a person who believes that humans aren't in control of objective reality, understanding objective truth and how to deal with it is the most important thing, since it allows us to deal with an ever-changing and complicated world. Thus, freedom of speech must be protected, since it allows societies to look for the truth most effectively. However, from the social justice viewpoint, that humans construct human nature, controlling how people think allows humans to be able to engineer our nature. Anyone who reads any history knows that human nature stays the same no matter what people believe. People can scream at the top of their lungs that their ideology or religion will abolish cruelty and corruption, but once that group gets into power, their elite, unless given incentive structures against those things, will perpetuate them. In fact, the people who are often most dangerous are those that believe themselves to be good, since they have no protections against their own evil. When a social justice person screams at you for saying the wrong words, they think that you are allowing racism to perpetuate and they're gradually engineering the human race to superiority. This is very convenient for them since controlling the discourse like Hollywood or school board curriculums is very easy, while they continue to eschew actually effective real-world measures. You know what would help Black America? Trade schools, improved education, more effective communities, and stable families. However, not a single modern social justice government is pushing for measures like that. I mean, just look at defund the police, where even though police departments are often corrupt and do really inhumane things, the number of unarmed Black men who are killed by the police is actually relatively small, and weakening the police actually results in far more Black deaths because it increases Black-on-Black crime, which is a far higher number. Social justice makes the weird logical jump that all disparities in racial income must come from racism today. This ignores that, first of all, let's say the difference between African American and white incomes is caused by many factors, including racism, but also factors starting in Africa, geography, culture, and historical chance. To say that deconstructing modern racism would help negate all of that history is insane. Something the movement always ignores is that if you look at an ethnic breakdown of income by groups in America, it's clear that America is not primarily based off oppression. British Americans are on the lower end of income among white Americans, while the highest earners are some of the most oppressed groups like Asians and Jews. You see big fluctuations inside the Black community with descendants of immigrants from the Caribbean and Black people whose ancestors were free before the Civil War being much richer than the rest of the Black community. Similarly, among Hispanic groups, race has nothing to do with wealth. The mostly white Puerto Ricans are much poorer than the darker-skinned Mexicans or Dominicans. Social justice theory believes in this thing called intersectionality, which holds that there's this underlying oppressive structure to society that oppresses women, gay people, ethnic minorities, etc., all at the same time. And once we remove it, oppression will be gone. They take this from Marxism, which has the utopian idea that once the capitalists are gone, the world will be rich and the working classes will live in plenty, but both are conspiracy theories. Saying that there's this secret cultural force that is secretly causing all of this oppression around the world without any reference to its own self-interest and only indirect proof that it exists literally fits the definition of a conspiracy theory. The good way to look for conspiracy theories is that they string a bunch of factions together into a black or white worldview. Yeah, let's ignore the massive differences inside the black or white community or men and women and create these binaries. One of the defining features of social justice is that it formed due to a confluence of different academic departments shoehorned together under the common alliance of intersectionality. Let me do the briefest possible rundown of each of these schools. The first is queer theory, which is the most postmodern and believes that human sexuality and gender is built off oppressive social structures rather than being a Darwinistic necessity which is built off ensuring the survival of the human race. It purports the theory of a gender spectrum that is entirely without scientific evidence as a starting point. You know when a kid just keeps on asking you why and then why again and then why and feels really smart once you can't answer the fifth why? That's queer analysis, which tries to break every concept down into logical salami slicing into irrelevance. An example I gave a friend is when we were on vacation together in a log cabin, is that the queer analysis would try to break down how the act of us being in a cabin really meant nothing and was inherently oppressive. Then there's postcolonial theory, which largely exists to blame all the failures of postcolonial countries on European colonization, ignoring any other factors and even saying that we should respect magical ways of thinking on a similar wavelength of thinking about modern science. Even reaching points like the West trying to promulgate education in the colonies or anthropologically study local cultures in a scientific way was cultural imperialism. After that is African and Latino studies, which rather than actually studying those cultures with any curiosity, turn them into grievance programs which largely blame Western civilization for every failing in those societies, which in its own way becomes its own form of racism that prevents these people from having any agency outside of the white man's story. Women's studies works exactly the same, except replacing women for ethnic minorities and men for white people. You have the body shaming and ableism movement, which don't have academic departments but are more widespread in social justice as a culture in the broader social sphere. The body shaming movement's really negative in that it tells fat people it isn't their fault and it's society's fault for not saying fat people are pretty. However, even though there is cultural fluctuation, beauty standards are genetically driven and based off Darwinistic fitness. At the same time, being fat is objectively unhealthy. Even though our society puts out unhealthy body expectations, going the opposite direction is just stupid. It's so depressing to see a generation of young women being fat, badly put together, and spewing anti-male feminist propaganda, and then wondering why they're lonely and no one will marry them. They've been sold an image of the world that's just not true. The ableist movement also says that people with physical disabilities aren't actually disabled, it's just society's fault for not recognizing them as normal. It would be good if society made it easier on the disabled, many of whom are veterans that have sacrificed for their nations, but this philosophy is pushed to horrifying extremes, an example of which is the TikTok mental health influencers who pretend to have mental illnesses in order to get attention. This in turn has caused a spike in large problems due to the glorification of these mental illnesses, which means lots of Gen Z kids pretend to have mental illnesses in order to look cool. The final part of the social justice coalition's environmentalism, which is honestly one of my soft spots to the movement. Global warming's an existential threat that we really need to get on, and nature is beautiful and ought to be preserved, and the right should be blamed more than the left for often just not caring, but the social justice attempt at climate change just isn't effective. You know what would help us turn away from carbon energy sources? Nuclear energy, and even more investment into nuclear research, which would allow these reactors to be far more efficient. However, the social justice movement has always been the group against nuclear energy. Likewise, the best way to lower carbon emissions would be to replace coal with natural gas, but the social justice wing has continually blocked policies supporting natural gas. Thus, in fact, social justice has hurt the environment far more than helping it. What do all these threads have in common? Well, first of all, they hold that whatever oppressed group they're supposed to protect has no agency. In their view, the only way ethnic minorities, women, gay people, etc., can be helped is by concessions from the broader society. In real terms, telling people that they're helpless is the worst thing possible. Even groups under horrifically oppressive conditions like the Jews, Asian Americans, or women in strongly patriarchal societies have been able to find ways to thrive in certain forms. I'm not blaming the oppressed for not doing more, but fatalism is the worst thing possible and not even true. In fact, social justice treats having initiative as morally wrong. I remember when J.D. Vance released his book Hillbilly Elegy about how he pulled himself out of poverty in Appalachia. It was widely hated since it was supposedly giving poor Americans false hope. There are so many think pieces about how heroic stories, whether Batman, Hercules, or the like, are oppressive since it encourages people to act and take initiative. I made a video here about how envy influences the social justice movement, and I can really see that, especially in this part of it.
To take something from that video, as social media distorts our view of reality, it makes envy more powerful. People see people more attractive than them and those that are doing better in general. And if you look at who social justice attacks, whether the wealthy white men, and especially with cancel culture, canceling celebrities or successful ancestors that we could possibly be envious against, then you can clearly see that the movement is driven in large part by envy.
Similarly, that no change is possible in the past, but all the change in the world is possible in the future. Africana departments like to say racism is as bad today as the 1960s, yet segregation is gone, America's had a black president, and an extremely disproportionate amount of American cultural figures are black. However, these departments act as if any changes are possible in the future, totally remaking society through social engineering if they're given power.
And finally, you can totally see the self-serving and irrational nature of social justice through how it treats the rest of the world. Feminist activists in America never talk about the worst treated women in the world, namely in the Islamic world and Africa. At the same time, social justice ignores horrible humanitarian crises around the world, like the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar, just only focusing upon the Western world. I mean, there are more slaves in the world now than there were in 1800, and a lot of them go in supply chains to make the stuff that we use, and you never hear supposed anti-slavery advocates talk about them.
And finally, they all ignore class, which I think is a tragedy since class is a legitimately big problem in our modern society. This is the era of the least meritocracy in American history, the highest inequality. As an example, 60% of the students in the top 20 American universities are from the 1% of wealthiest families. Social justice does lip service to class, but they treat all white people, even the ones who grew up in grinding poverty, of which there's a big number, as upper class in their worldview. None of social justice's policies target the many problems the lower class face, or do real-world policies that would help the lower classes. In fact, they end up opposing policies that help the working classes, like shutting down immigration and constructing tariffs. I think it's the greatest irony that they ignore the largest injustice of our times, and I don't think it's a coincidence in that this movement's concentrated among the college-educated upper and middle classes. The question that we face at this point is that if social justice clearly makes no sense, and you've got to remember this is a movement with some of the smartest people in the country in it, why are people incentivized to believe in it? What in our society makes us liable to this mass delusion? Before World War I, for better or for worse, the West was powered off a combination of Christianity, capitalism, nationalism, white supremacy, and science. However, the world wars were so traumatic that the West is still in a massive hangover and a horrifying reaction. World War I was an evil and terrible war, fought between nations that were pretty similar and highly developed, but showed that even after centuries of progress, barbarity lay beneath the facade of civilization. This was further reinforced when the Germans, supposedly one of the most civilized nations in the world, committed one of the worst atrocities of all time in World War II. Even the good guys in the war, the Americans, killed millions of people while using the most horrifying weapon of all time. This meant that the West is going through a crisis of confidence that we're currently living through. If the West could still perpetuate all these horrifying barbarisms in the world wars, how could it claim any moral superiority, and how could it claim its progress had any meaning? Although capitalism, science, and Christianity resulted in countless real-world advances and progresses, since they were used to justify the horrors that were the world wars, they were treated as if they were fundamentally evil. When you look at the group that really got with social justice and made it popular, it was the baby boomers, or the children of the World War II generation that largely tried to react against everything their parents stood for.
You can easily predict social justice philosophy based off what's the opposite of the Nazis. Where the Nazis were racist against non-whites, nationalistic, militaristic, and misogynistic. Meanwhile, social justice is the opposite, or racist against white people, says the nation is evil, is toxically pacifist, and says gender doesn't exist, but still hates men. The Nazis were so evil that people wanted to do the opposite afterwards, but truth be told, you can't just have two dots in your moral framework, and trying to do the opposite of anything to a ludicrous degree just brings out another evil.
The social justice philosophy gradually got put in place and reached its climax as boomers were in power for longer and longer, and were thus able to enact their worldviews. In short terms, the world wars were so traumatic that it resulted in the West trying to commit suicide, which is social justice. Saying that social justice is a suicidal impulse will be controversial, but it really shouldn't be. SJWs literally say that Western civilization, whiteness, are evil hierarchies that have to be ripped apart. They say whiteness is evil and try to increase diversity as a moral good, as if decreasing the Western or whiteness of an organization would make it better. They openly hate and try to destroy all the pillars of Western society, whether or not they're positive such as science, capitalism, freedoms like speech, and Christianity. They go even further, wanting to deconstruct any stabilizing force in society, whether the family, relations between the sexes, loyalty to higher authority, or property rights. The relativism and unthinking hatred of the West and social justice is disgusting.
This is literally the movement where feminists are allied with Islamic radicals due to their shared hatred of the West.
Likewise, the moral relativism in which any criticism of foreign societies is matched by the often ludicrous comparison to the West. Africa is corrupt and China's authoritarian, but so is America, they'd say, not realizing how wrong they are. The fact that people are actively breaking the law and often going on horrifying journeys to reach Western countries, while the reverse never happens, suggests that the West is doing pretty well as of now. This meme does a better job of breaking down social justice's suicidal impulse than anything I could say. This shows how every single action a white person could do is racist. The only thing a white person could possibly do to not sin is to support their cause and give them more power. The social justice movement has been so successful since in the vacuum of belief that came after the world wars crushed our previous moral pillars, social justice was simply just loud and there was no moral push back to work against them. Thus, those with scruples pushed aside those without in the disorganized opposition. Similarly, every vehicle of cultural output like education and media, or the people who could formulate arguments against social justice were heavily leftist. At the same time, social justice plays to genuinely worthwhile causes that the average decent person of a Western country would support. Your average modern person doesn't support oppression of gay people or ethnic minorities. I mean, I feel this. One of my best friends is a climate change advocate, and another is an ex-Black Panther who's an advocate for police reform. And many police departments around America do need serious restructuring, and we should be dealing with climate change. But social justice pushes for these worthwhile causes that one would look like a monster to stand against in the worst ways possible. The social justice movement likes to say that if they had more authority, they'd be able to fix the systemic problems. But from looking at real-world evidence, that's clearly not the case. There are plenty of areas that have been under the control of social justice ideologues and have been for a while. However, as a good example, look at the American West Coast, which has incredibly high inequality, still has a good deal of racial segregation, what amounts to regressive and classist policies like extremely strict housing laws, which hurt the lower classes, as well as being so negative for businesses as to weaken their economies, and crippling problems like homelessness and drug use.
I mean, as an example, look at the city of Los Angeles, which effectively stopped enforcing rule of law, and so mass robberies occurred in this train area, effectively turning it into a hellscape.
It's not a coincidence that people are leaving from blue states going to red ones at a really fast rate right now. 20 years ago, the West Coast was extremely creative, pleasant, and prosperous, so much so that it became the center of the future tech revolution. However, as left-wing ideologues seized control of these states, it precipitated their decline. Alternatively, look at Canada, where as radical leftists gain more and more power, they've pushed for authoritarian policies as leftists do every time. Which takes us to the main point. The social justice movements are predicted by what will give the college-educated more work. There's a brilliant historian named Peter Turchin who created a computer model that's been able to predict when societies divide and fall into civil wars across history. The driving factors are wage stagnation with rising cost of living and inequality, which means there's more competition and desperation for fewer good jobs. This pressure means that societies are split among different factions that want more jobs and influence for people like them. Examples of this across history include the English Civil War, the fall of the Roman Republic, the Russian Revolution, and I could name like 20 more. However, it's exactly what's happening in the modern world today. In modern America, the divides between the college-educated left and the right, who is a coalition of non-college-educated groups like the military, church, and businessmen. You can predict social justice's actions based off what gives people with college degrees more money and influence. Defund the police is giving influence to college-educated social workers over the police. The diplomacy emphasis is giving it to college-educated diplomats over the military. Regulation of business is giving college-educated bureaucrats power over capitalists. And social justice theory is college professors having moral authority over traditional religion. From what we've seen so far in looking at their actions, social justice isn't driven primarily by a genuine desire to help the downtrodden, since their policies have been universally ineffective, but keep on being pushed for without question since it's inside the self-interest of the college-educated classes. Social justice merely uses concern for oppressed groups as a way of creating policies that are good for them. Christianity's been the framework of Western civilization for the better part of 2,000 years. If you're a Westerner, most of your ideas on how the world works comes from Christianity, even with modern atheism making no sense without a Christian framework. As Christianity declined in influence, social justice largely took its place among the college-educated technocrat class mentioned before.
In Christianity, Satan takes on the outwards appearance of good, while in substance being the exact opposite.
This is the perfect description of social justice, which takes the main assumption of Christianity, that scapegoating others and treating them unfairly for things outside their control, as represented in the crucifixion, is evil, and pushes the veneer of that, while in reality going for the opposite. The famous Swiss psychologist Carl Jung had a term called the shadow. The mask is the part of your personality that you want to show the world, while the shadow is what you hide and comes out when you're not in your zone or are a poorly integrated person. Social justice is a representation of the toxic elements in Christianity parading under Christian virtues. An example of this is cancel culture. Across history, scapegoating was a holy rite in which a group would scapegoat a violator of group norms and muster together around the shared sin of killing this person as a way of bringing the community together. The crucifixion was meant to show that that was wrong, and one's connection with morality and God was what was important rather than group politics. Social justice is the exact opposite, and it's driven by group mores in which not being able to keep up with the slightest new verdict about what words are appropriate or not will result in excommunication.
It's a McCarthyism that tries to destroy dissidents' lives to supposedly save the community.
Social justice is powered by canceling those who violate it, thus making the cancelers feel virtuous that they're more moral. However, since canceling is how one shows moral virtue, it creates a repetitive cycle of more and more insanity and cruelty as the main moral arm of the movement. This is a process of trying to one-up each other in antisocial behavior, which is referred to by the Christian philosopher René Girard as mimetic, and is how social justice is largely driven, by crowd psychology. An example of the shadow is that social justice takes up the heart of Christian philosophy, or the desire to help the downtrodden, with a complete lack of moral structure. The biggest problem with modern ideologies is they believe that the ends justify the means, and thus completely lack a moral structure since everything is justified to reach their concrete material goals. Social justice has no framework for what being a decent person is, and thus is why the rudest, most intolerant, and cruelest people are often social justice warriors, since it's a philosophy that creates a veneer of morality, which justifies the worst possible actions along the way. Social justice overemphasizes caring about if others are harmed at the expense of everything else. It throws out and even disrespects traditional Christian values like the search for the truth, humility, courage, and patience, values that hold any stable and happy society together. As a Stoic Christian, when I talk to a Buddhist, Transcendentalist, Muslim, or most atheists, I know that we share the same core values at heart. That's not the case with social justice, which actively goes against the values of a stable society. From my study of history, I would say social justice is evil for a couple reasons. The first of which is that it shoots its own dissenters. The slightest difference in opinion will result in excommunication, which allows insane fanaticism and disconnect from reality to develop. Secondly, they have no moral compass, which is evident in that their supporters will burn cities, make policies that don't work, and ruin people's careers over minor statements, but you never see the movement hold its own members accountable. Literal rebellions are described as peaceful protests. You'll never see a person in the social justice movement say their movement did something wrong, except not being radical enough.
Christian philosophy refers to Satan as the Lord of Lies. This is since, as the search for the truth is muddied, it means humans have no guiding principles and automatically degrade back to base, disgusting norms. If the truth is gone, then the malicious can spread lies that benefit them more easily.
This is effectively social justice's strategy of saying objective truth doesn't exist, so you can only believe in their truth, which means they control reality. This is why they try to break down every barrier and scream at you when you disagree. A great example of this is that a group of professors once sent a series of fraudulent studies to social justice journals that were purposely ridiculous, like saying white people should ceremonially wear chains to atone for slavery, or copy and pasting Mein Kampf but replacing Jews with various oppressive groups, and they had all of them published in real journals. They actually won an award for a paper about how dogs humping in the park is a sign of rape culture. As I've said before, this movement has no morality and only cares about power. Now this is the billion-dollar question. How worried should we be about social justice, getting worse or seizing more power? Well, this is my answer. I don't think social justice will exist in 20 years. It's becoming so radical and disliked at such a fast speed, and it's so untethered from general public opinion that there's no way it doesn't burn out and discredit itself. Estimates put the social justice cadre at between 6 to 20% of American population, and we're definitely already seeing a backlash. My worry, however, is that the backlash will be something even worse than social justice. If an entire generation of young men grow up listening to insane feminism, the next generation of leadership might push too far in the other direction and become deeply misogynistic, for example. Industrialized populations, when pushed too far, tend to go to right-wing authoritarianism. Much of social justice is nasty, but it's too disconnected from reality to be really dangerous, which is not the case for the authoritarian right. It's our responsibility to make sure whatever backlash happens to social justice remains honorable and keeps the downtrodden from being hurt. The problem is that social justice will continue to get more radical, as it has been doing at faster and faster speeds, largely because their whole moral compass is built off showing themselves to be morally superior. I'm not sure where they'll go next. I'm already surprised at how far they've gotten now, to be honest. Similarly, if the recession that me and a lot of other people think are predicting will come, it will further worsen standards of living, which will make social justice even worse. In summary, expect this movement to get worse until it inevitably burns out due to its own ridiculousness, and then people will scramble to hide that they had ever had their pronouns in their social media. However, a big question is how many necessary traditions social justice will eat before it dies. Like communism, social justice never builds anything effective, but tries to rip apart social cohesion for more power.
Social justice doesn't even have a theory of constructing everything, with their entire worldview built upon taking from pre-existing successful organisms. Another very important thing to consider is that for a civilization to die, only the elite needs to be wiped out or become complicit in the civilization's death. And a major problem here is that these ideologues control the groups and systems that create much of our leadership class or the top universities.
The way you deal with social justice is to not surrender to them out of cowardness. They will merely install more ideologues if given the ability to do so and will immediately push for more concessions. If you run a company, don't let diversity coordinators show up, since they don't have an incentive to solve racial problems, which would end their job, only to effectively become commissars for their ideology in your organization. The way to fight social justice is to stand for good values. Stand behind things an 11-year-old could realize were true, like common human politeness, the truth, and honor. Like some horrifying Star Trek monster, social justice only gains power from our fear of it.
Otherwise, as we've seen with CHAZ, it's just a movement run by people who can't organize themselves, can't feed themselves, and aren't very well armed. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pearl, my social media, my Patreon where I've got the first couple hundred pages of my cultural history of America and history of the world. And as always, thanks so much for watching and have a wonderful day.